Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Visine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Visine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off.
Blast off on another VIP episode of Hero Paranormal Podcast. Broadcasting from the base at La Madre Mountain just south of Area 51. My name is Ryan, the original outlaw of the airwaves, bringing you an epic episode today. When it comes to research into the ins and outs of UFO flaps, few books compare to the painstaking work put into clearing the doubt surrounding the Pascagoula abduction case. On October 11th, 1973, many things transpired to a variety of people, lending credence to a fascinating array of anomalous activity of which the likes have hardly been seen before or since. Dr. Irena Scott dives deeply into one of the biggest UFO waves the planet has ever seen in her extremely entertaining new book, Beyond Pascagoula, the rest of the amazing story. Whether you opt for the hardback, paperback, Kindle, or audiobook, you will surely be blown away by the amount of evidence which points to a reality which is very hard to wrap one's mind around. Pinning down eyewitness accounts, paper trails, and any scientific reports available, Dr. Scott coordinates a sobering attack through logical data on a very chaotic scenario involving UFOs, abductions, and possibly the second loudest sound ever heard throughout time. Though her protocol is very scientific, she connects the irrational, spectacular dots of the 1973 UFO flap. Also, she adds further evidence exploring reports from various communities, universities, and government installations. Historians and even law enforcement archives tell a tale that reads much like an attack from outer space, with police switchboards lighting up with reports of flying objects. Police units even interacted with some of the UFOs during this wave of high strangeness. Dr. Scott has really delved beyond one of the most well-respected UFO cases and created a spectacular work of literature and considerable importance, relaying the facts about the most widespread of all UFO incidents. Dr. Scott, welcome to the Hero Paranormal Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Of course. Yeah, it's without question, you have really contributed so much to one of the most important cases in ufology. Your book, Beyond Pascagoula, is remarkably well written, researched, and documented. And firstly, before we get to questions, I really wanted to thank you for your contribution overall.
Thank you very much. I worked for quite a while on it. My book says many years, not, on it exclusively, but I put a lot of time on it.
Absolutely, and it shows. Dr. Scott, you've really created not only a masterpiece of historical evidence, but in my opinion, a very enjoyable book to read regarding what appears to be the most widespread of all UFO incidents. What prompted you to begin looking into this?
What prompted me was, as I wrote in my book, many, many years ago, I had a phone call from my mother, who was a skeptic. She was in Ohio, and I was in Missouri, about 600 miles away, and she asked me, "Did you hear a sound?" And I teased her about it, because she'd always said if she was developing dementia, we should tell her. And so I told her to, check in with the insane asylum, and joked around. And then several days later, she called and said that there was a huge UFO wave there, that everybody was seeing them, all kinds of people were seeing them, people were staying in at night, people were keeping their kids in, and all kinds of things. And that was strange from her, because she's, like I said, a skeptic. And even some of her friends saw them, and one of them had a UFO chase her.
Wow.
So anyway, I was in Missouri and not much was happening there. And I didn't pay attention to it. I just sort of thought it was a joke, and which it wasn't. But years later, I was in Ohio, working at Ohio State University, and they had a newspaper room with actual newspapers, and not those things that give you the headache when you turn them around.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought I'd just go in and browse, and just for something to do, see if I could find a date on that phone call about the noise. And the newspaper room was very daunting. It had zillions and zillions and zillions of papers, and I thought, I'll never find it. And I didn't remember the date. I thought it was around the middle of October in '73, but I wasn't sure even of the year. And so I started looking, and I found it really quickly, to my surprise.
Wow.
A little tiny article about the noise. And so I had a date. And this seemed pretty weird to be associated with UFOs, because UFOs are sort of ephemeral. They don't have many witnesses. They kind of sneak around in the dark and get one person and that sort of thing. And so I thought this was interesting, because this was an unexplained sound, but it was heard by millions and millions of people.
Yeah.
And so I was curious as to find what caused the sound. And I started investigating. And this was before I was into UFOs or anything. And I was, after doing some investigation, it still seemed mysterious. And so I was going to write something up in a peer-reviewed scientific journal about it. Well, the state of Ohio seismologist saw my submission and was quite interested himself, and helped me to find out about seismograph stations and all that, and do some more exploring. So anyway, I did publish and got it accepted in a scientific journal. Then some people that in Ohio that were UFO people asked me to give a talk about it, and I called it the Big Bang. And I did. And that's how I wound up getting into UFOs, through something else that happened at the same time as the Pascagoula abduction.
Amazing. Wow. And, it is just fascinating. I find that, in the multitude of reports and cases, there often seems to be what's described as an interactive behavior between the UFOs and the witnesses. In your book, you mention interactive behavior is a sign of life. And compiling this vast amount of evidence, what do you think these identified craft were doing here?
Well, I of course don't know, but there was a lot of interactive behavior on obvious things where people thought they were in telepathic contact with the aliens. There were a lot of cases where, like a truck driver might see a UFO and shine a light on it, and then the UFO would go away. But the UFO would swoop down on people, and things like that.
Yeah.
Which was basic interactive behavior, although a lot of it was just something such as if somebody shined a light on them, they might brighten up or move away or something. But it was interactive, showing that this is probably something somewhat conscious and not just a regular physical, physical event.
Absolutely. And many of the UFOs seem to be hovering near or around strategic military or technical manufacturing areas. What are your thoughts about this? Well,
Pascagoula, it's in Mississippi, and a lot of people think, oh, these are just, some people say Hicks or something, which isn't true. But Pascagoula is a top manufacturing company. It's has Huntington Ingalls Industry, which is where the abduction took place, and it's a top top Navy ship manufacturer. It's the top manufacturer of ships for the U.S. Navy. Also, in the same area is a Kessler Air Force Base, and it's one of the top places for training people. And at that time, there was also nuclear shipbuilding industry, which the government didn't want anybody to know about. It was right there too. And in other places, the same thing was evident, such as in Ohio, there were reports near Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. That's the main Air Force base with, it was where Project Blue Book took place and all the other forms of Project Blue Book, and where UFOs are investigated. And it's a top Air Force base for testing out airplanes and things, not like Area 51, but it actually has its own Area 51.
Yeah.
And it's where the United States actually developed flight. That's where the Wright brothers started out, and it continued into a huge Air Force base now that employs more people than practically any place else in the government.
Yeah.
Like the Pentagon. And the sound also went over kind of like the central part of the eastern United States, in such places of Washington, D.C., which is obviously the important government, the important central area of government, but also it has airports and observatories and that sort of thing. So it seemed like the wave wasn't just some subtle thing out in nowhere. It was around big manufacturing and government areas.
Absolutely. It was so wild. It really is. And I found it very interesting. The book details that the many independent reports and seismograph readings, surely they indicate something took place. And that is fairly hard evidence, in my opinion, that's difficult to ignore. What has been your experience of the official narrative trying to explain this away?
Well, they've always explained everything away. They explain away observations. Like if somebody says they saw something landing in their yard, they'll say, well, this is Venus. And even good photography, even some of the good photography they have now from ships and radar and things, they'll still debunk it.
Yep.
But I've never heard anybody debunk a seismograph recording, and there were 2 seismograph recordings of the sound, plus many, many witnesses. And so I think that this is good sound scientific evidence that something took place.
Oh, big time. Big time it is. And I think it's important to mention that this all occurred at a difficult time and political climate at the same time as the Yom Kippur War between Israel and a number of Arab states, and there was a nuclear alert of sorts. How did this affect the beliefs surrounding the massive UFO wave?
Well, I covered in another chapter UFO waves and what they're associated with. And people think they're associated with things like the media, like if a movie comes out, well, people see more UFOs and things like that. Well, that isn't what happened. I mean, like when some of the top movies about aliens came out, well, there wasn't an increase in UFOs. And when Russia sent up the first satellite, there wasn't any increase. And it's unknown why there's big flaps. But in this case, there was a whole lot going on. One thing was in the United States, there was the impeachment of the president and the oil shortage and things like that. But there was also, the 73 wave is considered by many to be the largest UFO wave ever, and the last one. And at that time, there was a Yom Kippur War, and the DEFCON 2 nuclear alert, which happened just a little bit after the October the 11th. I think it was October the 24th. And that was the last nuclear alert, and there's only been 2 or 3 of them that ever happened where there's a possibility of nuclear war.
Yeah.
And so this was a pretty intense time, and probably most people didn't know there was that, because they didn't declassify the nuclear alert until fairly recently, so that most people didn't know there was anything like that going on. But there was a possibility of nuclear war at that time.
Pretty big deal. Yes, it was. And,
Israel and the Arab states, if they had evidence of nuclear armament, and in that case, Russia would side with the Arab states, and the United States would side with Israel, and it could blow up the world at that time.
Really could.
Most people didn't realize it, but the flap was around that time too.
Yeah, it was high tense. Very, very tense times. And let's delve a little bit into that portion of history that we've kind of delved into. It's so enthralling. The massive sound associated with this UFO flap or wave was heard, as we mentioned, over Washington, D.C., and it occurred during a time of super high international attention, Watergate, and this nuclear alert that you mentioned. Did the White House ever come out with an official statement about the situation?
It never did. It's like it never happened. It made the newspapers across the country. It happened on the night of October the 11th, and I collected the newspapers from the 12th, and it made a lot of newspaper headlines over the area it covered, from Iowa to the Atlantic coast near Washington. But the very next day or so, people just forgot about it.
Mm-hmm. Which tends...
And that was kind of funny, because the same thing had happened when there was a flap over Washington, D.C. in 1952. There were sightings all over, and radar visual sightings and everything. And the government said, oh, this is just a temperature inversion, and nobody worried. And in this case, I think people forgot about it because nobody saw anything. And hearing something, I think, is different from seeing it. And the government didn't explain anything. There was no explanation or anything. They just made the newspaper headlines, and then everybody forgot about it.
Yeah.
Except me.
And I'm glad you didn't. I think a lot of us are glad you didn't forget about it. And something fascinating, which was outlined in your book, sort of on the opposite of the spectrum, was the statement made in the UFO Casebook by Kevin D. Randall, where he postulates that perhaps this well-documented UFO flap was what he called the October scenario, and possibly the only extraterrestrial visitation that has actually occurred on Earth. What are your thoughts about his theory?
Well, I think he explained that in more detail, but I think it's possible. And I line that up with that asteroid that came from outer space into our solar system. I can't pronounce its name, Oumuamua or something.
Yeah.
And left. That was a couple of years ago. And there's only been 2 of them so far that they've seen across our solar system. But back in 1973, if one did that, nobody would have recognized it. So I speculated in the book that possibly something like that had happened at that time, and maybe that was the one time we had been looked at by aliens.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I doubt it, but that's still what he speculated, and it's possible.
Yeah.
That something passed through our solar system right then and investigated us and then went on.
Yes. And I have a hard time pronouncing that Oumuamua too. But it is really something that intrigues me. It's such a interesting thing that it also kind of seems to catch a blind eye. Getting to the meat of the matter, the Abduction Scenario by Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker is by far one of the most significant in history, in my opinion, and the aliens are described so different in so many ways, in appearance and function. I mean, these alien entities look like nothing really described before this case, making it fairly unique. And it's almost like a different type of alien species came down for a while and had quite the heyday in their blue craft. And I get where people like Kevin Randall would get their theories, can we get into the things that made the 1973 UFO wave so much different than other UFO waves, in your opinion?
Well, one thing that made it different was the abductors. And usually when people describe aliens, somehow they have the idea that they're very slender beings with big heads and big eyes and all that. Well, these were about as opposite as you could get to that. They were sort of porky or portly or whatever you'd call it. Mm-hmm. Obese maybe, not quite obese, but heavy set, wrinkled. And they were mechanical. They gave the abductors the opinion, the abductees the opinion that they were mechanical, like robots or something. And they didn't have the big heads. They also didn't have the big eyes. In fact, they didn't even know if they saw any eyes. But where people have projections out of their head, they had like ears and a nose. These things had something sort of like carrots or something sticking out from where their ears, where a human's ears would be, and where the nose would be.
Just wild.
And they weren't sure if they saw a mouth or eyes, and so these were about as opposite as you'd get to what the norm. And then they also didn't seem to have legs; they seemed to be just floating around on pedestals, and so they were a lot different from the standard ideas of an alien.
They really were freaky. Scary, very interesting looking beings. And one of my favorite examples of interaction with these craft in your book actually took place with people in small boats interacting with craft swimming underwater. Now, not only was this one of the most amazing accounts of interaction with an underwater submerged object, but it even made the paper, but it was all but ignored and almost really made fun of. Can you describe to listeners what took place in the murky waters of Pascagoula that night?
Well, there were two. Pascagoula, surprisingly enough, made the top news twice. One was this abduction, and the other was underwater. This would be called an underwater submarine object, USO instead of UFO. Uh-huh. And there's only one person alive. There were 16 people that saw it, only one person alive, and I interviewed him several months ago and put it in about a year ago, and put it in the book. The abduction was not, people harassed Calvin and Charles about the abduction, and everybody, a lot of people were saying, oh, this was just ridiculous, it couldn't happen, all that. But the underwater observation was taken very seriously and investigated. It was, and what was interesting about it, it was taken seriously. And one reason was because it was near the Huntington Ingalls boat manufacturing place. It was near the atomic nuclear submarine area, and near Kessler, and with all the other things that were going on in the government. Well, they took this very seriously, and what was odd was that the abduction actually took place closer to all those manufacturing places than the underwater observation. And so but the Coast Guard and the Navy took the underwater investigation quite seriously. These fishermen were out, the Pascagoula was on October the 11th, and the underwater was November the 6th, which wasn't too long afterwards. Mm-hmm. These fisher people were out in their boats, fishing away or heading nets out. And they were people that had always been out in the water and lived there and were very familiar with the water. They saw this thing underwater that was lit up, and the first people tried to explore it and understand it, and they had a long oar and hit it. It sounded like something metallic. It was, the man I talked to described it as like looking at the top of a parachute, that it was like the top of a parachute with lines going from the middle and something in the middle. And so he and his father, he was 16 at the time, tried to figure out what it was, and then the father's twin and another boat came up and tried to figure out what it was. So eventually they couldn't, and they took the boat back to the Coast Guard station and reported it. Well, 2 Coast Guard officers came out, and they saw it too. And they were just as perplexed as anybody else, because like if you didn't bother it, it would just be there and be lit up a little bit. And sometimes it would really light up bright. It was underwater. And then if they bothered it, it would turn its lights out. But it also would travel with its lights turned out. And then it would show up someplace else. And so they had hit it and things like that. And one of the Coast Guard people said in his notes, when you held an oar over the light that was coming out of it, it was like X-ray light. Mm-hmm. It would go right through the oar, and the oar wouldn't cast a shadow, wow, which is very, very, very strange. And nobody had any idea what it was. They thought it might be something spying on them, but it wasn't anything like a normal submarine or anything. And it seemed to know its way around, and there was a deeper area, a deeper trench that went to the Pascagoula River, and it mainly stayed along this trench and traveled along this trench. But 16 people saw it, including 2 Coast Guard people, and nobody had any idea what it was. And this was taken very seriously, and the people were questioned by military authorities and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I just found that was such an interesting part of the book. Just it seemed like you drew such great imagery and such a good picture of what took place. Within days after Calvin Parker and Hickson's abduction, Pascagoula was the focus of international news, even though their abduction case had elements that were much different than just about any other well-known abduction, as far as description of aliens, the hissing, the robotics, etc. Neither one of them has ever changed their story, regardless of the various interviews, including those by Professor James Harder and J. Allen Hynek. I mean, Charles Hickson lived until the age of 80, and despite ridicule, never backed down from his story, as your book outlines. If anything, it seems like this abduction case only gets more concrete the more people look into it. Would you describe that as the case in being accurate?
Yes, because sometimes, like if people are lying, sometimes they'll embellish and they've had 40 years to embellish on this. And nobody embellished. They just said the same thing they said to start with, which suggests that it's something they remember, not something they're making up. And there were a lot of other reasons to show that it wasn't something they made up, like UFO events and abductions are often presented as hoaxes. Mm-hmm. But in this case, it happened to them, and it was very, very, very traumatic. I mean, they were both just shook up out of this world. And then, like, when the things returned them from the ship, well, I guess Calvin was just standing there with his arms up in the air and couldn't move, and then Charlie brought him to, and he fell down, and they both fell down. And at first they didn't want to say anything to anybody because obviously nobody believed them.
Right.
But anyway, Charlie was older, and he'd been in the Army and in life or death situations, and he was kind of able to hold up to it, whereas Calvin was 19, and at that age, it was just terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Well, after a while, Charlie decided to report it, which Calvin was very much against. And Charlie, first of all, he tried the newspaper, and the newspaper was closed at that time of night. Then he tried Kessler Air Force Base, and they told him they don't do UFOs anymore. Blue Book was closed. And that's something, at that time they'd closed Blue Book, and there wasn't any place to report those things.
That's right.
And so the Air Force told him to report to the local authorities. So Hickson called the police, and you can imagine how how brave he had to be to call the police, because they would say you're crazy. And so he called the police and said, "You're not going to believe this, but we were abducted by a UFO." And the person he called did kind of believe him, because you could hear Calvin in the background crying and begging him not to report it. So they brought him into the police station, and the police had sent out these bulletins that these two crazy people, drunk people, had been picked up and claiming they were abducted and everything. But anyway, they brought him into the police station and questioned him separately, and then put him together in a room, and then left the room and left him alone. And what they didn't know is that they had left a hidden tape recorder in the room, and they thought this would be the way to catch him.
Mm-hmm.
If they were hoaxing, they would laugh and joke about putting one over on them and everything else. Well, his mystery tape recorder, when they played it, showed that they were very much telling the truth, that they were both terrified. And Calvin had said he felt like he died, and he was praying and everything else. And so they believed him. And that helped their credibility a whole lot. And they both said they would take lie detector tests and everything else. And so right off immediately, they were believable.
Absolutely, they were. And, I'm always fascinated by Calvin Parker's expression on his face. He just looks like he's seen a ghost in almost all of the images. It's pretty amazing and pretty telling. Let's get into the serious government investigation just a little bit that you mentioned that took place after the Pascagoula abduction case. And do you believe this had something to do with Huntington Ingalls Industries being close by?
Well, I think the Coast Guard and the Navy investigated it because of that. There was a top shipbuilding area, and there was also, they were building nuclear submarines too, and even today nuclear submarines are very much in the news, like when the United States sold them to Australia recently, and let me see, there's something else. It was on the news. But anyway, they're in the news quite a bit today, and they were, I think, hiding the fact that they were building nuclear submarines in from the public.
Yeah.
But the Coast Guard the Navy was quite sensitive about that.
Makes sense, with good reason. Yeah, definitely. Now, possibilities of a remarkable double abduction case. Let's get into the Blair family. And the Blair family was, I believe, the first people you interviewed, and was a very moving interview for me in the book. What was it like interviewing the Blair family, and can we explain their experience for listeners?
Well, we first found out about the Blair family because Calvin had given a talk this was after he came out of the closet on UFOs just a couple of years ago and wrote the book. He'd given a talk in Pascagoula about the event, and it was on YouTube. And somebody had written to YouTube and said, "Oh yeah, my parents were there," or something like that. And so Philip Mantle contacted her and found out who her parents were. her parents hadn't said anything about it. But so I called her parents. He wanted me to call from the United States because he was in England and had, an English accent and everything. And I could record, with people's permission, the conversations. And so I called Maria Blair. And he said first talk to her husband, and I did. And he didn't talk very long. He just said he heard a big splash and something about a blimp, and then he handed the phone over to her. Well, she said that they were on the opposite side of the river from where Charlie and Calvin. And they were waiting to go on a boat. Her husband and his supervisor were taking a boat out. But his supervisor had been held up by bad weather or something and couldn't get there. And they had found that out, and they were sitting there in the car waiting for the supervisor to show up to go on out on the pier and get into the boat. And I guess her husband was sleeping, and she was watching out the window, and she started seeing this thing flying around. And she thought that this is very, very strange because it wasn't like an airplane. It was just flying around like it was browsing or looking for something, like it was lost. And she told her husband, it looks like the airplane is lost. What's it doing? And she said it just didn't look anything like an airplane. I mean, the way it flew around. And then her husband decided to take his clothes and get in the car, and I guess it was about 9 o'clock or so. And so they walked out the pier. He was ahead of her. And she said this thing that looked like a man came out of the water right beside her on the pier. And she was absolutely terrified. And then it didn't come up again. It went back in the water, and that's all she saw of it. Well, so then they went on to the boat, or the ship, and she came back around 12 and was just terrified and ran back to the car. And she seemed so emotional about this thing that came out of the water that I called her several more times and talked. And she was still emotional. And got, more descriptions and everything.
Yeah.
But later, unfortunately, her husband became very ill and unfortunately died after that. But he thought this might be his last time on Earth. And he had always been a debunker and told her not to talk about it, that nothing happened, everything, was normal, nothing could have happened and everything. And when he was very, very sick, he said, yeah, they'd been abducted, but that he didn't ever want to talk about it. And so he started telling her about being aboard this object and about how these things came out and got him and brought him in the object, and he remembered being inside it. And then he remembered the beings, or whatever they were, swimming back across the water, and he remembered the object taking off. And then he was put on a ventilator and he couldn't talk. Mm-hmm. And that was something that happened to him just after they were married when they were young people. They'd raised their family and everything. And she'd been upset for her whole life about what happened. And he had always debunked her and said nothing happened. Well, then just at the end he told her, yeah, something happened. Then, so he said it on the telephone on video to Philip Mantle, too, that they'd been abducted. So far, she remembers, some of it came back to her, and she remembers seeing the object. She remembers seeing a bright light. She doesn't remember being inside it. He remembered being inside it, and she thought there had been some real bad physical examination of him or something, and maybe that's one reason he had never talked about it. But so it appeared that from what they were saying, that they might have been abducted too, and possibly by the same object that abducted Calvin and Charlie.
Yeah, absolutely. It's wild how a lot of these things, there were, in your research, you found numerous components to the October 11th event, and many of them were mentioned in other places. Thunderous booms, UFOs, abductions, and more simultaneously with Pascagoula. And even, can we tell listeners even about strange beams of light and their unusual characteristics?
Yeah, well, one that happened right then was when the Coast Guard person held the oar over the light coming from the thing underneath the submarine object. He said it looked like the light was like X-rays and went right through it. Mm-hmm. And another abduction that took place during the flap, it wasn't exactly that time, it was in South America. And this man said that this object was over his car, and that his car was just like it was transparent, that he could see right through it. It happened to him twice. And there were a number of examples of things of just really strange light, such as those.
Yes, very strange. I also found it amazing that there was, right around the same time period, if I don't want to get this wrong, but I want to say somebody from the Philippines was actually, quote unquote, kind of found in another country, thousands of miles away. And there was a lot going on. The blast, or the booms, the bizarre events that occurred simultaneously, it happened in no fewer than 10 states. Is that correct?
Well, it was reported in 10 states, and when I started looking more, it might have been even 12 states, because I added Iowa. Uh-huh. And there were evidence of the boom being heard in Iowa, too, although it hadn't been reported in the newspapers then. But it was in the Iowa newspapers, and, you know, today you can get on the Internet and do more exploring of newspapers, and I think it was like maybe 12 states.
Fascinating. It is so, so wild.
It was very, very large. It was, like I said, about the second most extensive sound ever recorded, aside from Krakatoa, the volcano.
It is, yeah. It's just amazing. And the color blue repeatedly came up in the book as part of the descriptions people gave to what they witnessed. In your research, did you find any telling information about the color's significance?
Yeah, I ought to do a scientific study of that, too. Normally, airplane lights are green and red and a white strobe light. And meteors usually look like something burning. So blue is not a natural color that you see. You don't see things flying around lit up in blue in the sky. But a lot of the reports had blue in them. For example, Kevin and Charlie, what they saw when they first saw it was blue. And quite a number of other people saw blue objects or objects with blue lights, and that seemed like it was pretty weird, because it wasn't what, if you were reporting airplanes and you were mistaking them for a UFO or something, you would say green and red or white. You wouldn't say blue. And a lot of the objects they saw didn't seem to have strobe lights or things like that, like the airplanes would either.
Yes, absolutely. There's something to the blue. And the blue lights are mentioned in a lot of other international cases, and they do seem to have, I don't know. There's something eerie about them. The October 11th sightings were weird enough, but can we discuss how there was an extensive October 17th wave and even humanoid sightings there?
Yeah, on October the 17th, there was also a boom, but it wasn't like this boom. I mean, this boom went from Iowa across to the coast, and it was incremental, so that it was heard a little bit farther later as you went east. The other boom, there wasn't enough information. It wasn't big like that. But on the 17th, there was a huge amount of all kinds of UFO sightings and humanoid sightings. I think there were 7 humanoid sightings on that one night. And there were a lot of reports, like, for example, in Pascagoula on the 11th. Well, there were a lot of reports besides the abduction, and there were about 50 official reports, but which is a whole lot for one night. But a lot of unofficial reports either. There were people calling all over and reporting to the police and things that they saw something. But in Columbus, Ohio, on the 17th, there were 150 reports of UFOs,
Jeez.
which must have been a world record. I mean, I saw nothing like that anyplace else. And there were also, I think, around 100 reports in Wheeling, West Virginia of UFOs to the authorities, and they said it was about ready to break out in a panic there.
Mm-hmm.
So in a lot of places there were just a huge amount of UFO activity, and just vast numbers of reports of people seeing things. Like my mother said, people were keeping their kids in the house and things like that.
Sure.
Like a war zone.
Don't blame them. It would seem like a War of the Worlds scenario. And a number of the agencies and officials seem to have dispelled the idea that any of the booms or sounds were an airplane sonic boom, because none of our aircraft that were manufactured could have caused a sonic boom quite like that. Is that correct?
Well, when I first started investigating, I was working with some scientists, and they were quite interested. And, you know, wanted the information, said if they found out anything, they'd let me know and help me. And, you know, scientists are supposed to be skeptics and always disproving everything. Well, these people seemed interested. They were geologists in general. But then I published about the sound in the MUFON Journal, which is a UFO journal. And surprisingly enough, that's where I got debunked. And I was debunked by this person saying, well, this was an SR-71 airplane. That's a big supersonic airplane. They don't fly it anymore, but it could go way, like 5 times the speed of sound. It's probably the top airplane now. So
interesting.
That was where I got debunked, was by the ufologists, but by one of them anyway. However,
sure.
At that time, I kind of weakly defended myself and said, well, the sound wasn't where the airplane was, which is true. But I didn't really have too much information. However, fairly recently, NASA had published information about what the sonic boom of a SR-71 and what sonic booms are like, and published a lot more information. For example, the sonic boom of an airplane depends on its height, and for every 1,000 feet high, there may be a sonic boom carpet of a mile and things, but the way to dissipate a sonic boom is to get higher. And if you get higher, there's less air and less sonic boom. And so, anyway, I had the equipment to answer that question in my book because of the NASA information. And so I had plotted where the SR-71 went, and it was well attested to because the pilots had written a description. It was a top secret mission then to the Middle East and everything. Mm-hmm. But they said where the airplane was, and where the airplane was, it was at 80,000 feet. It went from Beale, California to sort of halfway in between Indianapolis and Chicago, and then up to Griffiths Air Force Base, which is near Rome, New York, up in New York a ways. And basically, nobody had heard a sonic boom where the airplane was. But this sound was not where that airplane was. It was miles and miles away. And even if it had been a sonic boom, it would have been on both sides of the airplane only for 40 miles.
That's
right. This was like it could be like 600 miles away from where the airplane was. And where the airplane was, people didn't report a sonic boom.
Absolutely.
It was the sound went across the United States from approximately Galesburg, Illinois, straight east, whereas the airplane would have gone northeast. And my debunker had drawn a triangle where the sound was and reported this was from the airplane, but he didn't even show where the airplane landed in his triangle because it was off, not in the triangle area where the sound was, so he's kind of debunked his own hypothesis.
Yeah, and I really appreciated that you did actually include that triangle in the book, an explanation. And I mean, when you're talking about over 10 states, I mean, it's pretty wild. Something else that really, stood out to me was October 13th, I know I'm not going to say this correctly, the Wapakoneta Daily News reported that actually a television newsman caught an identified flying object on a movie film. And I thought that was pretty telling with this UFO wave that, someone who you would expect would not try to muddy the waters actually caught it on film.
Well, yeah, and during that time, the governor of Ohio reported a sighting. There were a lot of police and everything else. You said to start with interactive. Mm-hmm. Well, the objects seem to be interactive with a lot of authorities, like the police, and that sort of thing, which is kind of interesting too.
It really is.
It takes a lot of nerve for a policeman to report a UFO because people might even lose their job, and some of them did.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was a big deal. And there were so many cases like that, so many significant cases with people reporting things that obviously didn't want to. Just imagine the ones that didn't report things. And you've really created a literary marvel with this book, in my opinion, and gone above and beyond in connecting many of the strange dots surrounding the Pascagoula abduction case. Can't thank you enough for your contribution. And can you tell listeners, as we wrap up, where they can purchase your book and keep up with your work?
Well, all my books are for sale on Amazon.com. This one's called Beyond Pascagoula. My other one is UFOs Today. Another one is Inside the Lightning Ball. And another one is called Sacred Quarters. They're all about UFOs. And they're all on Amazon.com and published by Flying Disc Press of Philip Mantle. Okay.
Good to know, and I'm sure that they're all amazing. Thank you so much for your contribution, Dr. Scott. Thank you for coming on the podcast, and I hope we can have the opportunity to chat again in the future.
Well, I hope we can too, and thank you very much.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Irena Scott bringing the heat and bringing tons of conclusive evidence, everything from boats interacting with craft, people interacting with craft, multiple accounts of abduction, humanoids, loud booms in the sky, strange lights of a bluish nature, which made things seem invisible. Truly enthralling. And the massive sound associated with this UFO flapper wave going over, a portion of the United States that encompassed more than 10 states. Really, she created a masterpiece of historical evidence, very enjoyable book, well documented. This UFO flap was more than just an October scenario, as portions of it actually delved into November. It seemed appropriate being in October ourselves right now, and the effect of beliefs surrounding this massive UFO wave haven't changed much. We still have many debunkers, no matter how much concrete, hardcore evidence is presented. Furthermore, the evidence exploring these reports from various communities, universities, and government installations seem to conclude that something took place. And whether this was an actual visitation from another world or other creatures or an alien, quote-unquote, presence, will probably remain unknown. However, I believe that these particular alien entities surrounding the Calvin Parker and Hickson abduction look like nothing ever really described before, and it remains one of the most unique, concrete, and profound cases in ufology. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time, keep your eyes to the skies, feet on the ground, but don't forget to take a look around.
Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Visine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Visine. Blast off, blast off, blast off.